Welcome to the Bradenton area, on the Gulf Coast of Florida, where the easy pace of island life comes naturally in this coastal playground with endless white sand beaches, stunning natural preserves to explore, relaxing vibes all around, and it's a seafood lover's paradise. Plan to stay a while to explore vibrant downtown Bradenton with top-rated attractions like the Bishop Museum of Science and Nature, and discover this friendly community set along the Bradenton Riverwalk, where you'll find lots of surprises around every corner. Come lose yourself in the sun-drenched Gulf Coast and change your reality here in the Bradenton area. Discover Florida's West Coast in Bradenton, Anna Maria Island, and Longboat Key. Learn more at BradentonGulfIslands.com.
Hello, good morning, good afternoon, good evening.
Good afternoon.
Depending on where you are.
Yes.
Valeria, please.
Now, this is a very important moment in our conference because we have the pleasure and the honor of the presence of Jonathan Reynolds as keynote speaker at our conference. Jonathan Reynolds is one of the leading academic experts in the study of the retail sector internationally. He is academic director of the Oxford Institute of Retail Management, associate professor in retail marketing, and deputy dean at Saïd Business School. He is also deputy director of the ESRC's Consumer Data Research Center. Jonathan's teaching and research focus primarily on the retail sector. He is particularly recognized for his scholarship and expertise in the areas of electronic commerce and omni-channel retailing, innovation and entrepreneurship in retailing, retail productivity and skills, and the role of place in marketing and retailing. His views are sought after by businesses, policymakers, and the media. He is heavily committed to knowledge exchange, actively seeking to ensure that his research can be widely disseminated amongst policymakers and practitioners. While his academic expertise lies in marketing and geography, Jonathan's research activities have also extended into science and technology studies and strategic management. He is a founding member of the Oxford Institute of Retail Management and has been its academic director since 1999. The Institute undertakes a range of both commissioned and public domain research with direct relevance to practitioners, but which is nevertheless grounded within rigorous academic scholarship. So a great welcome to Professor Reynolds. Welcome to GLOSERV.
Thank you, Valentina. Thank you, Chihan. It's great to be with you, if only digitally rather than in person. And our three-way conversation between Naples, Italy, Florida, and Oxford. So greetings from the Oxford end of this arrangement. It's a real shame that we can't be in person in Naples, but I'm sure we look forward to a chance to do that before too long. Thank you for inviting me to talk today. And if I could just share my slides, Chihan, that would be very helpful. My brief from the organizers was to take a step back from some of the detailed issues that you'll be considering in your various discussions and presentations over the conference, and to perhaps think a little bit more about the longer term perspective, about how the retail landscape is likely to change over the next few years. And I was given the target of 2030, which is around about kind of 9 years from now. But actually, certainly based on the last year's experience, we've had 9 years change in the last 9 months. So looking 9 years ahead, I think, is a particular challenge, but also a great opportunity to reflect on some of the questions and issues that we as academics and scholars ought to be considering. So over the next 45 minutes or so, I want to do three things. I want to look back, because I think a historical perspective on change is really important. Sometimes we spend far too much time in the moment and not perhaps contextualizing some of our thinking about the retail sector, amongst other things. I then want to look forward and itemize a few of what I would see as the biggest challenges facing the sector, each of which I think has scholarly implications in terms of the kinds of research and the kinds of discussions that we as academics should be having. And finally, I want to consider the implications for scholarship, thinking about whether scholars with the present publication processes can be agile enough and multidisciplinary enough to meet the needs of the sector and of each other in thinking about the future of the retail economy and ecosystem. So that's my kind of brief over the next 40 minutes or so. And at the end of that, I think Chihan and Valentina are going to invite questions, and we'll have a chance for discussion at the end of this. Let me launch into what I wanted to say. Thanks to Valentina, I don't need to dwell too much on this, which is just my background and credentials. I'm, as I said, director of the Oxford Institute of Retail Management, research in a variety of areas, and publish in areas like retail innovation and planning. I'm a geographer by background, and my commercial experience is with Tesco, the UK grocery retailer, and with Coca-Cola. But I've been in Oxford now for a number of years, and I'm currently Deputy Dean at the the Saïd Business School. But let me go straight into the first building block of the comments I want to make today, and that's really about looking back. And I could think of no better kind of advocate of a historical perspective than the well-known academic, now retired, Ron Savitt, who in 1989 observed that, quote here, looking at our own past is the best way to predict what the retail scholar of 100 years from now can learn about contemporary retailing. And that's absolutely right, because when we look at the past, we see many of the echoes of some of the challenges that we face today and will face, no doubt, in 100 years' time. And it's quite intriguing to see some of the similarities of some of those challenges. And so I wanted to take you through, in just a few minutes, some of the lessons from retail history that I think have particular resonance today. And I have to say, of course, the first of these, given the current pandemic, is that, of course, we have dealt with pandemics before. And we've also badly named them before. So we call the one in 1918 Spanish flu, even though the research tells us it started in an army base in Kansas. But certainly the impact of that pandemic was at its end far more significant than that of the present coronavirus pandemic in the world today. Some 500 million people, a third of the world's population at the time, were infected with that virus, and it led to around about 50 million deaths worldwide, and probably an underestimate given the ability to count at the time. But what struck me about the lessons from that particular experience, that public health emergency, if you like, was how many features in common it had with the reactions of today's governments and states and citizens to the threat of a health emergency. And in particular, the kind of drastic steps that were taken, closing orders for all stores except food and drug shops, reduce crowding on transportation line in rush periods, timetables for theatres and social distancing and so on. And a real debate about the tension between the regulations for closing things down to protect health and the need to protect the economy. And interestingly, the technology at the time was pressed into service in the same way that it has been in the present pandemic. So, for example, we see this: stay at home, shop by phone. Pre-internet, Uncle Sam joins us in the fight against influenza, lifting the ban on store deliveries to homes, which existed in 1918 because stores are protected in law against home delivery in many states in the US, and some of the big shops having to close over weekends and so on. So nothing particularly new in this kind of historical event. And indeed, perhaps if governments had looked back and read up on some of the mitigations of the pandemic in 1918, they might have been able to move rather faster and rather more effectively in mitigating some of its effects. But as we see, the kind of peaks and troughs in pandemic were very, very pronounced. Certainly, if public health emergencies had a common feature with today, the other common feature I wanted to pick out was technology. And certainly, retailing has always been driven by technological change. There's a popular conceit somehow that today's experience with the internet and with e-commerce and e-commerce platforms has been, almost a novelty and something that's new for the sector. Well, actually, if we look back, we see that technology has played a really very significant role in transforming the sector. Think about the growth of the railways and maritime transport in the 19th century, allowing goods to be shipped and transported across the country to be made available in stores for our consumption. Think about the family motor car, which gave us mobility in the late 20th century and supported the growth of out-of-town and peripheral retail developments. Think about the kinds of investment in vehicles and in technologies that allowed retailers to grow at scale and to take power away from manufacturers in the value chain. All those were to do with particularly innovative technologies, whether they were new fridges, refrigerators, whether they were escalators or elevators. So the moving staircase and the slide there, bottom right, shows the elevator in Harrods, where it was such a novelty that customers who used it had to be revived with smelling salts at the top of the staircase. But a form of technology. And two quite particular ones that have played a big influence on retail development and change. One is the cash register, invented by someone who made not much money from it, James Ritty. He actually sold the patents to NCR, who made all the money, and he died penniless. But he got the idea from the way a ship's captain steers the ship and determines engine power by transmitting information to the engine room using the controls, and invented, in effect, a cash register that did the same kind of thing. There's a great field for a machine that can do this work, was his observation. So, cash registers to store and to tally takings was absolutely a technological innovation at the time. Likewise, information systems. And some of you may be old enough to remember in some of the older department stores around the world, these kinds of pneumatic tube systems were still in use as late as the 1960s and 70s. Certainly, a department store I used to work in had these to communicate between the shop tills and cashiers and the finance department upstairs. And this moved information around, not electronically, but physically around the building. These pneumatic tube systems, invented in 1799, were in many ways the precursor of the kind of networking that we see much more digitally today, of course. And we see it in supply chain and logistics. And there was no shortage of predictions of the future. Back in 1900, French cigarette companies were putting little cards in their packs, forecasting what the year 2000 would look like. And here's what they suggested the rural postman would be doing in the year 2000, which is on the back of a sort of glider, delivering the post to people living in apartment blocks around the country. And of course, if we think about today's experience, then we can lose the postman, but we have the drone delivering in many parts of the world and receiving approvals for further and further long distance flights with more and more weight on those distribution systems to deliver directly to the home. Similarly, if we think about business models, again, nothing new under the sun. Indeed, the wheel of retailing model by McNair kind of captures the cyclical nature of innovation in the sector. And if we look at business models, then we see, today, people forecasting the death of the department store. Well, over 150 years ago, they were forecasting its rise, and it was seen as a significant threat. So the birth of the department store in many parts of Europe and North America was accompanied by a lot of opposition to transformational business models. And here's the example of a department store that opened in London in the late 19th century called Whiteley's, developed by William Whiteley, who basically bought up lots of adjacent houses, stuck them all together in one big department store, but differentiated his offer by claiming to, as it says here, sell anything to anybody, combining dissimilar goods in one business and offering cut price goods for cash only. So here was the innovation. It was actually an assortment rather than a specialty retailer, and it was offering goods for cash only rather than for credit or for negotiated or for haggled kind of terms. And at the time, there was outrage in London when this department store opened. Shopkeepers burned effigies of William Whiteley in the streets. So although we're not seeing effigies of Jeff Bezos being burnt as far as Amazon is concerned, the same kinds of debates about traditional forms of retailing and new forms of retailing dominated the popular press and popular imagination. And we see that too with mail order. We all are very much aware of the growth of the big book mail order businesses in the US and in Germany and in France over the last 120 years. In many ways, the precursor of the non-store offer that we see through e-commerce. But at the time, it was by no means universally popular. So here's the Montgomery Ward catalogue from 1895, which claims to be the largest mail order business in the US, supplies for every trade and calling on earth, was the including groceries, was the claim. Didn't go down terribly well. The quote there is from the Chicago Tribune from 1873. Beware, don't patronize Montgomery Ward & Co. They're deadbeats. In fact, they keep altogether retired from public gaze and are only to be reached through correspondence sent to a certain box in the post office. If you tried to contact some e-commerce only merchants that are not very responsive, you'll know how the Chicago Tribune felt at the time. And what's also interesting is to do two things. One is to compare that with the Amazon mission today, to build a place where people can come to find and discover anything they might want to buy online, with Montgomery Ward's original mission. What's instructive is that Montgomery Ward lost its way in the 50s and 60s, went into stores, and actually ended up going out of business. So some object lessons, I suppose, for new entrants into the retail space. So business models are certainly a source of innovation historically, and we see patterns of replication through history. Likewise with mobile retailing. We think that our kind of mobile phone is the first and ultimate representation of mobile retailing. But here's an example again from a chocolate company in Germany in 1900 forecasting what mobile retailing would look like in the year 2000. And for them, mobile retailing involved putting shops on trains and taking them around to people rather than people having to come to the shops themselves. And you might think that's quite a bizarre kind of feature, but the only thing really we lack are wheels on our mobile phones, I suppose. And some of the contemporary stories about trains and consumption in the UK, some very enterprising people are quite good when the trains are running at being able to order pizza from one station and pick it up from the next. So there seems to be a good association between trains and retailing. So looking back, we see, I think, some very useful and important reminders that what we're experiencing at the moment is by no means for the first time that retailing has always been about change, and that in fact, perhaps the last 10 to 15 years of relative stability before the internet came on the scene was perhaps unusual in historical context. And actually, turbulence, transformation, change has always been the story of the sector. And that the last few years, in many ways, have been an exception to that. So let's now turn this around and look forward and think about some of the big challenges. And of course, thinking about it as we speak at the moment, we face, I think, a considerable degree of uncertainty. And uncertainty is the theme I want to use as the binding agent, if you like, between all these kinds of challenges. I think we're all aware of the nature of these kinds of challenges. What we're not aware of is how they're going to interact, how they're going to play out ultimately in terms of the implications for the retail sector. There may be many kind of choices that companies have to make, depending on which direction these challenges actually go in over the next few years. And what's heartening is talking to retailers around the world. Many of the best-in-class retailers are embracing the uncertainty. Here's Jesper Brodin, the CEO of IKEA, who last year said, like most retailers, we don't know exactly where we will land at the end of this, but our curiosity and willingness to create will be a guide for us. So here's someone who's willing to embrace the uncertainty of future change in the sector. And I think it's heartening to see how many CEOs are in that kind of position. There are some that aren't, and some of those businesses have ceased trading or are in significant difficulty. But those that can manage uncertainty effectively, I think, are well placed to deal with some of the challenges ahead. So what are the challenges? Well, remind ourselves that uncertainty is only one part of the mix. Many of you will have come across the term VUCA, volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity. There was a terminology developed first in the US Army War College in the 1980s to deal with some of the difficulties surrounding implications after the Cold War had largely finished at that time. And management gurus adopted those terminologies, and you've seen it used everywhere, but in the, if you like, the consultancy circuit. But what's really interesting for retailing is how many of these challenges fall into the uncertainty box. We know relatively quite a lot about the situation. When we're going to talk about this in a few moments, you'll recognize many of these challenges. But what we don't know is on the left hand, the y-axis, is how well we can predict the results of the actions that we might take in this kind of space. So it seems to me that what we're facing at the moment is a large amount of challenge in that blue uncertainty box. And I've chosen a few of these to focus on in some more detail. It's what I call the certainty of uncertainty. And in part, I've been using a very useful annual kind of guide to this produced by the UK Ministry of Defence, which looks at global geopolitical challenges over the next 50 years and seeks to derive some patterns and some predictions from what it's observed. They look as far as 2050 in this case, and they say there are a few convincing reasons to suggest that the world will become a simpler and more peaceful place, rather it will become ever more complex and volatile. So that's the kind of start of the 10. That's the ultimate challenge that I think we all face and we all recognize. And I think that is a particular both difficulty but opportunity for the retail sector. So I've chosen 5 challenges I'd like to just flesh out in a little more detail before talking about the implications for scholarship. The first of these is pandemic recovery, of course. And when you think about some of the aspects of this, the world will face not the challenge that 1918 faced in terms of 50 million dead and 500 million infected. Still vast numbers, but not anywhere as big as that. 159 million cases to date, 3.3 million deaths, but those numbers are rising. And the economic impact of that. So the global GDP impact last year of about 5% negative, higher in Europe for 2020. But not just recovering from the health crisis, but recovering also from the economic crisis. And the uncertainties of what that means for the retail sector in the short to medium term, let alone the long term. So we're already trying to second guess which sectors or formats, which consumers will be the winners and losers as the various lockdowns around the world are released. And we see revenge shopping as consumers kind of jump back into stores because they've been taken away from it for so long. But our question is, how long will that rebound last, and what will be the new equilibrium that we will start to see? And one particular question that has emerged is around the continuing role of online, because of course that has seen significant growth in the last 12 months. The graph on the right there is the UK situation from about 2006. It shows internet sales as a percentage of total retail sales. And you can see it hops along quite steadily, growing year on year, each Christmas being slightly higher than the last. And that's the peak that you see on a regular basis going from 2006 onwards. Let me perhaps zoom in on this so you can see it more clearly. That would seem to have been the continuing trend up until March 2020. And you can see that in the UK, with a lockdown in the middle of March 2020, we saw a large number of people, including a lot of new customers, embracing online. And the percentage of total retail sales accounted for by online jumped from around about 22% to around about 35, 36%. And in fact, went even higher in the second lockdown that the UK had, which is just starting to be released at the moment. And of course, a big question for scholars, but particularly for practitioners, is, well, does this represent a pattern that will stick post-pandemic? In other words, will people, having got used to online or tried it for the first time, actually stay loyal to those businesses? Well, this is a much more complex question to answer than many of the pundits and the consultants would lead us to expect. It's not just a matter of individuals staying with this. It's actually the ability of the supply side to cope with that extra demand. So, for example, the ability for grocery firms in the UK to respond to that extra demand was very varied. Some firms were unable to scale online delivery slots fast enough. Others, like Tesco, tripled the availability of online slots within around about 6 weeks because of the way in which they picked and packed goods. And as a result, the overall grocery impact rose from 6% to 12%. It doubled in the space of around about 6 months. So supply side was able to respond in many instances. However, there are two challenges in thinking about the persistence of online growth at this rate. Firstly, is not everyone is happy with the shopper experience of that online growth. Getting delivery slots, for example, has been a real challenge. Substituting the kind of browsing behavior that we quite enjoyed in stores with much more commoditized utilitarian online buying has not been everyone's cup of tea, everyone's kind of preference. And so we've also seen shopper dissatisfaction with online experience as it's scaled over the last few months. And our early evidence suggests that in the UK, at least, this is slowly dropping back a bit as the new data starts to come in during this year. Secondly, we have a real challenge around the commercial risks of moving sales that were in stores to online. And there's a quote from the UK CEO of Sainsbury's saying, well, moving sales from out of our most profitable convenience channel and driving a huge step up in online grocery participation, our least profitable channel. So in a sense, retailers who are responding to consumer demand are actually deliberately moving sales into less profitable channels as far as they're concerned for multi-channel operators. We've also seen the growth of express services, particularly around the parts of North America, China, and in many parts of Europe. And the question is, how long will these persist? given that they are premium price. They largely succeed because there has been little alternative to ordering online, but there's been a lot of investment in these kinds of properties. How long will those kinds of business models actually become viable? And how many competitors will be allowed in that kind of space? And again, what's the long-term equilibrium? So the pandemic recovery is the first of those challenges. The second is around managing socio-demographic change. And again, this has always been on the agenda. If you look longer term at the way in which our world has developed from the point of view of urbanization, from the point of view of migration, the longer term pattern has been for increased urbanization, in other words, internal migration, but also increased international migration. Before the pandemic put a halt to many of the international moves that were being made. And certainly, we've seen 2 billion more people by 2050, potentially living in urban areas, higher migration, but paradoxically, perhaps lower connectedness between communities in urban areas. The question is, where will we likely to find this, and what will be the pandemic impact on some of these patterns? So pre-pandemic, many of the forecasts were suggesting that the growth in urban populations would largely be seen in Africa, in South Asia, the Middle East, and in Southeast Asia in particular, parts of South America. Far less continued growth in Western Europe and North America. This is where the urbanization processes would continue to take place. Now, a big question today is how sustainable is that kind of forecast post-pandemic? Pundits were saying last year, cities are dead, people will not return to them. Well, this has already proved to be a mistake in the forecast. Today, we just saw some data in London that says that rental levels have fallen by 10% in London, making it more affordable or less unaffordable than it used to be for people thinking of living in London. So we can already see some of the parts starting to move, which actually means that those urban growth poles will be much more attractive, perhaps, than we had expected they would be post-pandemic. But for retailing, what does this mean? Think about the implications. If we have urban growth, the associated trend is perhaps towards urban convenience growth in supply. So perhaps those fast express grocery operations will be very successful. Perhaps we need more convenience or proximity stores. We'll need perhaps high density urban supply chains and distribution systems, different from the ones perhaps that we have today. And given increased international migration, will we need retail offers that meet increasingly diverse population needs as cities around the world become much more ethnically diverse. And some of the predictions have also been taking into account the future nature of urban development. And many of you will have come across this notion originated by researchers in Paris, the Sorbonne, the notion of chrono-urbanism, where everything that you need is within a quarter of an hour walk of your home. Your shops, your school, your work, your leisure is all close at hand. It's all convenient. And if public policymakers are moving down that direction, then it suggests even more that convenience and proximity retailing is going to have to be at the heart of some of the commercial aspects of that kind of urban development. My third challenge is around technology. I think accelerating technological advancement, looking 9, 10, 15, 20 years ahead, goes much further than simply e-commerce and social media. It goes into much more radical areas, potentially, like advances in human augmentation. Just as we see self-driving cars, so we start to see perhaps individual citizens augmented in a sensory way. So we saw certainly the failure of Google Glasses, but we see many more attempts to try and give us heads-up displays, physical augmentation through lift assist devices, and indeed even cognitive advances in augmentation. So making us smarter, stronger, and more connected individuals, if you like, over the next medium to long term. And the second broad trend that the Ministry of Defence forecast certainly saw was around automation, which again we can already see happening, but where certainly in the next 10 to 15 years we start to see robot and unmanned systems as ubiquitous as computers are today. So we start to see the wholesale shift across to these kinds of unmanned or robotized automated functions. And again, what are the implications for retailing of this? Well, first of all, what will shoppers be able to do that they can't do now with enhanced cognitive functions, access to augmented reality and virtual reality, and so on? What new opportunities present themselves in the commercial sense? And of course, all this depends on data collection, indeed generates data in vast amounts. The quantified self, the individual human being who's throwing off measurements about themselves, metrics that can be captured by others, already causing big ethical concerns worldwide. But think about the opportunities for retail firms to gather that data and gain insight into it, but have they got the skills and the talent that are required to do that data justice? And then finally, I suppose, particularly in relation to robotized systems, the potential for 3D printing and additive manufacturing to invent a new kind of retailing, a kind of self-service retailing, where actually the intellectual property lies not in the physical product, but in the blueprint, the template that is used in the 3D printer to print and generate a physical object. And that, I think, is probably a far more radical transformation of the concept of retailing than e-commerce or omni-channel retailing actually is. As I say, this will require, I have to skip this slide, this will require significant investment in data and insight and machine learning. And of course, we'll have a panel on this subject shortly, I think, on AI. We do see AI capabilities in retailing quite widely distributed, but not universally distributed, with many firms experimenting with the use of AI. And there's an example here from China, which I often regard as the world's retail laboratory. Used to be North America. I think China has very much moved to the fore in this area. Here's an example of a number of players in this space, which are unmanned 24-hour self-service C-stores. And this particular one, Bingo Box, founded in June 2017, has around about 500 stores, 160 square feet, where one person can look after 40 stores remotely, and also act as a kind of back-end customer service representative. And the AI piece comes in here with the data gathering that comes from the self-service aspects of the customer in the store, and the way in which replenishment is managed with an AI wand. I think we have just a bit of time. I'll just show you the video on this.
支付成功。
有未支付商品，请放回货架。
发现陌生人进入。
So you can see there, and I'm sure many of us use that video and others like it in our teaching, the examples of future retailing now, in a sense. But what strikes me actually is how similar that innovation actually is on wheels compared to the mobile retailing example I showed you from 1900. It's a little smaller and more compact, but the principle is largely the same. Move the supply to areas of demand. And AI, in this case, is using these devices as data gathering. So as the founder, Chen Zhilin, comments, by analyzing and acting on bingo box stores consumption data, we never have to worry about excess supply or shortage of perishable foods. As long as there is demand, we will always have supply. So we can already start to see the way in which data will drive this transformation forward. And my fourth factor is, or challenge, is around resource scarcity, sustainability, environmental stress. It's not surprising this is in here. This is a contemporary concern, has been for a number of years. It's come to the fore over the last 18 months, particularly in many geographies. But we all know that the world is facing the reality of significant constraints and demand for resources. Thinking just about water shortages, nearly 4 billion people worldwide suffering already from water shortages. The sustainability challenge is not likely to reduce over the next few years. And the cost of change for government and society is going to be significant. So let's think about what the implications are for retailing of those kinds of forces. We can think certainly about the fact that it's much more difficult to sustain polarization between those that have access to these resources and those that do not. There is pressure for global lifestyle changes, I think, impacting retailers and supply chains. It's no longer a kind of voluntary activity to engage in these sorts of activities. And the kind of greenwashing that many firms engaged in is no longer acceptable. And it affects the nature of demand, it affects the role and location of stores, it affects the nature of e-commerce. And we can see this from a couple of examples I have for you here of current initiatives, let alone initiatives over the next 10 years. We can see this ranges from IKEA's investment in their circular economy and circular hub. This is from one of their UK stores I visited last weekend, just launched this week in the UK and in a couple of other markets. The very much more common reuse and packaging-free dispensing of product in food retailing. This is an example from Asda in the UK. But perhaps more radical solutions are required. And the middle example there is H&M, which has a concept production facility in Sweden, which is taking apparel and recreating it, so breaking it down, adding sustainable additional fiber, and then reproducing an article of clothing. H&M Loop, it's called. So closing the loop in a sense on the circular economy. And the investment in this remanufacturing technology is a really interesting response to resource scarcity and a much more tangible response, perhaps in some of the CSR types of initiatives that we have seen over the last few years. And even in e-commerce, Jeff Bezos, writing his letter to shareholders this year, is suggesting that Amazon will be the heart of the change in sustainability, particularly around transportation and cardboard packaging and so on. And here's the example of the electric vehicle technology with something like 100,000 electric delivery vans that he's ordered over the next few years from Mahindra and from Mercedes-Benz, which will be used to produce more sustainable last mile distribution for the organization. And my final example, before I think about the implications to scholarship, is around power transition and diffusion. Here we see, a world really facing not an existential challenge, but certainly a challenge of power struggle between state actors and non-state actors. And by non-state actors, I'm thinking of the big platform companies, the tech companies whose reach extends beyond individual nation states. And we can already see, for example, bottom left, Facebook behaving like North Korea as Australia wakes up to news ban. And today's headline from the Financial Times: Brussels loses €250 million Amazon tax case in latest court defeat. The ability for individual nation states to regulate tech and e-commerce platforms starts to become problematic in many jurisdictions. And we see equally the reverse challenge of how private companies and NGOs kind of regulate themselves. We see that with the Facebook kind of scrutiny panels and so on. And what are the implications for retailing out of all this? Well, we have to think about non-state actors becoming retailers, therefore becoming very powerful entities. We have to think about the extent to which traditional retailers might want to collaborate with these non-state actors. And we also have to think of it geographically. If we look at the map of the world there, we see Amazon dominating North America and South America, We see JD.com and Alibaba dominating much of Asia and growing into many Southeast Asian markets, but we don't see a dominant player in Europe. So who's going to win that marketplace fight in Europe? Amazon is well entrenched, but we also know that JD.com and Alibaba have strategic plans to invest in those particular markets. We also know there's a real legislative lag, which perhaps works against governments being able to respond quickly to these kinds of challenges. So I'm going to move to my final couple of slides, which are around the implications for scholarship in the last 5 minutes, because I think there are some quite significant implications for scholarship. And here's a quote from me. The specialist and incremental nature of scholarly investigation may not be best suited to understand the rapid and holistic nature of change in retail ecosystems currently being experienced. That's something an exam question. Basically, what I'm saying is perhaps are we, as scholars in the modes of inquiry that we have, well equipped to understand the holistic nature of change and the strategic nature of change that's happening within the retail sector, or are we only able to focus on limited aspects of this change? So I think there are some significant implications to scholarship. It comes down in the end to what kind of retail research we want to do. And I was minded to look back at a presentation I gave actually back in 2003, and this slide comes from that presentation, where I was trying to put together the relationship of scholarship with the work of consultants. This is a work of a colleague of mine, Christine Cuthbertson, who did a really neat kind of diagram, which sort of tries to summarize the overlaps. And that circle in the middle is in effect the kind of retail research that we want. It's the body of knowledge that we want to explore. And the challenge we have as scholars, I think, in reacting to those big global challenges is actually, do we become generalists with interest in retailing, or do we become remain retail specialists in respect of particular subject areas? And we certainly see an emerging core of scholarly study in retailing, but how well has that survived over the last 15 years? It's been much more difficult to get retail-related articles into mainstream management and economics publications, for example. And we find that often the research that we do on retailing is assessed by non-retail specialists as academics. We find also that certain geographies tend to drive consideration of methodological assessment and what are dominant and fashionable methodologies to use in the work that we do. And perhaps subject concentration and institutional constraints, publishing in a particular range of journals, can drive out the opportunity to be interdisciplinary or to work in non-core areas. And the risk there is we become introspective rather than anything else. I did a quick analysis of publications on retailing dealing with the future over the last 20 years in the world of science kind of corpus. And over that 20-year period, there are about 42,000 articles on retailing, but only 4% were dealing with the future of retailing, a very crude kind of analysis, covering 65 journals, and there were 8 kind of clusters of journals put together. 65 journals sounds like a lot, but you can see that where the majority, based on the bubble size, of those articles were actually placed. We have a highly concentrated kind of destination for many journal publications, but actually a big diaspora of other journals where retailing might be tolerated or seen in a different specialist context. And yet, if we wait too long, then we will find consultancy gets ahead of us. That other part of the diagram that I showed you earlier. So if we look for hits in Google search for retail future, there are 500,000 hits today on that subject. So we don't have a monopoly as scholars of interest in what's going on in the world. And the role of management consultancy, when compared to academic researchers, has changed quite dramatically over the last 10 to 15 years. Consultants are what I call concept hungry. They want ideas that they can sell quickly into the marketplace, and academics sometimes sell their wares far too cheaply. Consultancies are also good at developing white papers very quickly. Both practitioners and to academics. Do we just attend conferences like this, read newspapers, follow our noses, or do we go out there and actively set agendas? Well, of course, I think it's a bit of both. And that diagram on the right there is just a Google Trends results for retail future. And as you can see from March 2020, the interest in retail future has golfed the scale in terms of Google interest. So finally, some food for thought. there are many kinds of research questions and a big research agenda that what I've described could inform. Here are some of the questions I think are quite interesting ones to explore at a higher level. And I go back to the notion that often we're too backward looking. We look at things that have happened already rather than thinking about aspects of the future, or at least we don't have a balance between the two. And that even happens amongst practitioners. So Doug Gurr, who used to run Amazon UK, commented, we've learned over the years that it is hard to predict the future, so we tend to put our energy into focusing on the things we think are not going to change. So here are some questions about things that are going to change. What kind of businesses, actual or new, are going to succeed longer term in capturing customers' awareness and attention? And how will we know how successful they have been? How will they create and capture value? What new kinds of intermediaries will emerge, whether digital, physical, or hybrid? And what business models will be most successful in the next 10 to 15 years? What are the kind of power relationships that will work between traditional retail businesses and online only, or other kinds of new entrants? And we're seeing a vast number of new entrants. Who are these new kids on the block, and how will they fit into the ecosystem? What are the kinds of capabilities and skills that organizations will need to meet the challenges that I've outlined? I've given you some examples of AI in this area, but also thinking about the socio-demographic changes that we're likely to face, also thinking about some of the implications of sustainability and of the circular economy for retail operations. Do we have the right kinds of skills as a sector, and what are those skills? And thinking about leadership as a legitimate area of study in business schools, what do these new leaders look like? What skills do they need to have? And what do organizational cultures that will succeed look like? And how are they different from the ones that have gone before? Finally, we'll find, of course, that these challenges aren't all heading in the same direction. Some of them interact, some of them compete. So think about convenience as against experience, for example, or think about utilitarianism against the fully fledged sort of immersion that we can get from wandering around somewhere like Italy, slow food service. How will these trade-offs and tensions inherent in the longer term be resolved, and to whose benefit over that time? What I've tried to do over the last sort of 40 minutes is to remind us of the lessons from history. We shouldn't forget that some of these things have happened in different forms before. What do we learn from that? And how can lessons be transferred if they are transferable? But also how complex and multi-layered and competing even the short list of challenges are in looking ahead for the future, and what a rich research agenda that creates for scholarship and for academics around the world. So Valentina, Chihan, I'm going to pass back to you. I think there are a couple of questions already in the chat, but I'm happy to take any more that you might have. There's one here that says, what's your view of the future of restaurants in front of dark kitchen and food delivery? Will it be the same in different countries? Well, I think my response to that is it will be different. We're going to see different kinds of responses in different countries because food is inherently a local phenomenon. It's much harder to get standardization in food offers, whether that's grocery or food service. And whilst at one level we may very well see the proliferation of dark food service chains in particular geographies, there are also going to be different manifestations, I think, of these dark kitchens in different parts of the world. Shihan, anything from your end?
Yes, Jonathan, we have a lot of questions, so I'm going to show them to you.
Okay.
We'll try to, some of it you already covered, but I would like to ask you, please, to see if we can get as many of them as possible. So
okay, so I've got the clock on my screen. We have 10 minutes, so let's get going.
Yes, we do. So I will read what will retail shops into showrooms in the future with a majority of shopping done online.
Right. So this is a classic hypothesis that we should be testing. And it's a very simplistic one because actually showrooms suggest that this is a polarized function. The stores will only be galleries and showrooms rather than performing other kinds of roles. And what we are starting to understand is that even pure play retailers are starting to think about physical presence, whether these are lockers, and we have some lockers outside the Oxford rail station here for Amazon, or whether these are fully fledged physical units. So thinking about the complementary roles that stores can play in relation to online is really where we should be focusing our attention. It's not a matter of showrooms and online, it's how the two could work together. This may be about distribution, it may be about certainly customer service that we perhaps can't get online. We want some personal attention of a kind, a demonstrator attention, to be trained, to be made more aware of the product in home improvement, for example, to be able to get style advice from fashion advisors in person. We could see very different and quite much more nuanced sorts of roles for stores, rather than simply the simplistic notion of a showroom, which I think is certainly one end of the spectrum, but is not going to be terribly attractive to many customers. So I think those spaces are going to have to work much harder.
Jonathan, maybe that question is related to this one also too. Which format is likely to dominate multi-channel, cross-channel, or omni-channel in near future? I think you said that multi-channel, right?
Well, I find these terms to be challenging semantically, because actually, everyone invents their own term. Omni-channel succeeded multi-channel, and so on. And we should not be just thinking about channels. We should be thinking about the customer experience, irrespective of channel. And what ways can we use? What touch points are available to us as retailers to meet the needs of the customer? And if we think in terms of channel, then already we're kind of dividing things up into slices. Although I recognize that we do need some terminology. Some of that terminology is often a little flaky in terms of its definition and its origins. So omnichannel, for example, comes from a consultancy paper around about 10 years ago. Certainly when I was first started to work in this area was called teleshopping. So I think the terms change. What we should be focusing on are things that don't change, essentially, which is our customer, if we're a practicing retailer.
Okay, next question. Do you believe AR, VR, and you had some information about this, will have an important role in the future in retail industry? And also the person adds, what's the impact of 5G in this, which is the telephone fast?
Yeah. So basically that's really about speeds, isn't it? That second part. But my sense is at the moment we have tried virtual reality experiments in the past for retailing. Some of you may remember Second Life, which was a sort of virtual landscape of virtual reality that was created in which your avatar could live and shop. And some retailers, particularly luxury retailers, created virtual stores in that virtual environment. The experiment failed dismally. The firm, I think, is still in existence, but it's changed its business model completely away from retailing, because simply the technology couldn't cope. Behaviors weren't ready for it. We didn't have properly immersive technologies that allowed us to really get into sort of the virtual environments. Clearly, we're seeing some advances in this area with headsets and head-up displays and immersive technologies and so on. We're not quite there yet, is my sense. Perhaps we will be in 10 years' time. And so at the moment, the future is very much around augmented reality, I think, the immediate future. We're already seeing some great experiments, some great trials, some great commercial activity. I mentioned IKEA earlier, placing a piece of furniture in your own, a virtual piece of furniture in a physical environment and viewing it through your phone at the moment is certainly commonplace for many retailers. 5G, I think what that does is it's emblematic of in effect an increase in speed, and reliability of the connection, which means you can pump more down the connection, and surely that will help very bandwidth hungry virtual reality trials, I think. But it's instructive to note, how many firms have tried and failed in this space so far. Not to say that they're wrong, but the timing could be off. We're not quite there yet in terms of the environment, the consumer behavior mindset, and thinking of this as kind of mainstream activity. But we're step by step, I think we're getting there.
Wonderful. Next question is about the academics. Observing retail industry's vast change may be disappearing. What are your views on the careers in this industry? Several retail management degree programs closed. Is this still good field to study? I know that you have a center in retail.
Yeah. But actually, we don't have a course. So unlike many universities that have a research center, that have a teaching program, to prepare people for retail careers, we don't have that. And that's partly because we don't do a lot of sectoral stuff in Oxford. It's very much around kind of vertical skill sets. And clearly the skill set that is most in demand at the moment in the sector is around data science. So if you think about, I did some work just looking at the UK marketplace, the number of vacancies in data science, not just in retailing but elsewhere, were phenomenal. So there's a challenge for education institutions, I think, to retool themselves to meet the new curriculum needs of the changing nature of retailing. And this isn't about training people to be store managers. It's giving them the skill set where they can function in a variety of retail contexts, whether these are channel-based or other activities. You know, a retailer by definition is about buying and procurement. That's a skill set that's common across channels. It's around distribution, whether that's to stores or to individuals or to click and collect hubs or whatever. You know, so there are some basic and fundamental skills. There are also some new skills that are going to be required. As I say, data science is amongst those, as is probably a whole range of whole toolkit of technical skills outside data science to actually help deliver some of this stuff. But we mustn't forget still, you know, the commercial skills that are required to understand the customer and to meet the customer's needs through whatever route the customer actually wants to pursue. And so it's a shame that we have seen retail management programs disappearing rather than evolving and transforming to meet those change needs.
Exactly. And I have a question about here about what you already mentioned in your presentation with, for example, this self-service 24-hour, the video that you showed. One audience member is asking, do you believe that technology service about self-service stores will replace almost all humans in retail stores? Not just buy one. What do you say?
No.
Okay.
I mean, I don't think it will. I think in certain commoditized areas you may see that, but can you imagine walking into a luxury retail store and not seeing someone who will cater to your needs? You know, I think we are some way off from the humanized robot that has the social skills to deal with a high net worth customer who wants to buy a Burberry handbag. So you know, my timescale is to 2030. I'm not sure we'll have that functionality by then. So at the moment, I think no is the answer. And I think in some senses, the human contribution to retailing will become ever more specialized and differentiated. You know? I think that we may start to see polarization between retailers that do become more commoditized and self-service and automated. And then, you know, in some senses, human contact and human service will become a real differentiator for many organizations. It will be something special to meet someone and get a personal service from those individuals.
Maybe they'll start charging extra for human service.
Maybe they will. Maybe they will. Yeah, absolutely.
It's interesting. Okay, here's another question. I know I'm going fast, Jonathan. I hope you don't mind.
That's okay. That's okay. I'm looking at the clock. We're fine.
What's the impact of the changes you described on the small retail shops, independent ones, not the chains?
That's a really interesting question. And I think let me just focus on the markets I've looked at, which is the UK and parts of Western Europe. And I think coming out of the pandemic, I think we've, you know, clearly those independent stores, many of them have been really badly hit. You know, they've racked up lots of debt. They haven't been able to trade in many countries. You know, they haven't got the deep pockets of many of the large retail chains. But what's happened in many geographies is that, you know, the rental landscape has kind of softened a bit, and it's become more possible for new entrants to move into certain types of locations because of the closures and vacancies that have emerged from the big retail chains, particularly in large city centre areas and so on. So I think it has shaken things up a bit, but there's no denying that, you know, the independent retailer doesn't have the you know, the scale and scope and the resource often to do things at scale or you know, take advantage of some of these more expensive technologies. But of course, there are some real advantages of some technologies for small scale retailers, provided they can get seen, and it's much easier. The barriers to entry are much lower for launching online and for reaching a larger audience. That's been known for many years. So in some senses, the opening up of the ecosystem away from just physical stores makes online retailing more possible. I was just looking at an example today where one of the oldest shops in the world in London, which is actually a nautical rope supplier, its physical store, the landlord has refused to lower the rent, and so it's closing its physical store and going online. And because it's a specialty store, it's called Albert Bean, I think. Because it's a specialty store, people will flock to the website and buy things in ways that they wouldn't be able to do in going to London to that single store to buy things. And so they've made a strategic decision to be an independent business, but to be an online only independent business and close their store. So I think many independent retailers have more choices than they used to have, and perhaps more opportunities to get on the radar than they used to have.
Jonathan, we are out of time, but I've got one more question because it's from UK, and you may be very familiar, and I love Costa, not only for their coffee, but their soups when I was in London. So Costa bought Brico, an automated self-service coffee kiosks.
Yeah.
Do you believe that we are going to 100% humanless? I mean, you kind of said it, but what do you think about that? They invested heavily in this.
Yeah. If you'd asked me 2 years ago, I'd have said, yeah, we are. But actually, the pandemic has left us so starved for company. I do rather wonder whether, in the medium term, we're actually going to be grateful to have conversations with people over the counter. So, for example, I'm talking to you from my office in Oxford, and our catering team is doing a great job. But occasionally, I need some exercise, so I go across the rail station, which is very, very quiet at the moment, and I talk to the people running the kiosks there, because they're pretty bored, actually, because there aren't many customers. I've learned far more about the nature of those businesses and people's lives and experiences as a result of just me wanting to have a chat with somebody, having been locked down for so long. So I think, going back to my previous answer, I think there is absolutely a market for the self-service operation. I think the Japanese experience tells us that, with vending machines and so on, for a segment of the population. So I think, the cost of decision is certainly investing in that segment of the population. But I suspect that might be smaller than it would have been, certainly in the short to medium term, as we kind of seek out human contact post-pandemic.
Wonderful. Thank you, Jonathan. This was excellent. I just want to remind our viewers that I apologize. There are many more questions that we didn't have a chance to get to. But remember, we have a MOOC course. It's free of charge. Please feel free to go to moocacademiacentral.org and ask your questions. I will convey them to Professor Reynolds, and I will also communicate back to you his answers. Jonathan, thank you so much. What an amazing presentation. We appreciate your time and contribution to GLOSERV.
Not at all. Hope the rest of the conference goes well. Great to see you all.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.